In this benchmark video, I compared the performance of my old rendering machine with a Ryzen 1600X and 2133 MHz memory to my new rendering machine with a Ryzen 9 3900X and 3600 MHz memory. I also tested the CPUs with a usable overclock and the 3900X with and without the faster memory. In all of these tests, the only differences are the RAM, CPU, and overclocking. But the same MSI X470 motherboard, Cooler Master Hyper 212 CPU cooler, 2 GTX 1060s, 2 RTX 2060 Supers, a Western Digital Black 500GB NVMe SSD, and an 850-watt EVGA Gold power supply was used. If you are only interested in seeing the numbers, here you go. They're all right here. But if you're interested in seeing the individual benchmarks, I have all the benchmarks in this video in a pinned comment of this video with a list of clickable timestamps you can click on to navigate to that specific benchmark. Please note that all of these scores were likely hit by a tiny penalty due to OBS running in the background in order to capture the video. At the end of this video, I will have a summary of my conclusions. V-Ray benchmark is a ray tracing benchmark that can test the performance of CPUs or GPUs. In the benchmarks I performed, the Ryzen 5 1600X when running at stock clocks of 3.6 GHz scored 7,486 K samples, but with a moderate 3.95 GHz off-core overclock, it scored 7,853, which is about a 5% boost. The Ryzen 9 3900X at stock speeds of 3.8 GHz scored 19,445 K samples, but with a mild all-core overclock, it only scored 19,978 K samples, or a mere 3% improvement. However, when the 3900X is paired up with faster memory, the results are much better. With the same overclock, going from 2133 GHz memory to 3600 GHz memory, I saw an additional 6% performance boost with a score of 21,309 K samples. When using V-Ray to benchmark the GPUs, I actually saw a very slight decrease in performance when the 3900X was used but not overclocked. However, once the 3900X was overclocked, there was a slight improvement, and again another slight improvement when the 2133 MHz memory was replaced with the 3600 MHz memory. But for the most part, the scores were extremely similar. However, that's pretty much what I expected since the GPUs were being used to run the benchmark. Octane benchmark is another ray tracing style benchmark, but unlike V-Ray, Octane only benchmarks the GPUs. The result of this benchmark was nearly identical to the V-Ray GPU benchmark in that at stock speeds the 3900X performed slightly worse than the 1600X, but once overclocked it performed slightly better, and again slightly better when the 2133 MHz memory was replaced with the faster 3600 MHz memory. But all in all, the benchmarks were very similar. When running Cinebench R15 CPU rendering, the 1600X scored a low but respectable 979 at stock speeds and a slightly more respectable 1046 with a moderate overclock. However, this is where the 3900X is allowed to stretch its legs, and the 12-core, 24-thread CPU took full advantage and scored a very respectable 2,597 even at stock speeds. When the 3900X was overclocked, it scored 2,712, and when it was paired with the faster memory, it scored 2,836. When running the Cinebench R15 GPU benchmark, things start to get very interesting. The GPU benchmark is very similar to gaming in that the results are in frames per second. The benchmark resulted in a not awful but not all that good 87 frames per second with the 1600X running at stock speeds and a slightly better 94 frames per second when overclocked. However, when the 1600X was replaced with the 3900X running at stock speeds, the benchmark resulted in a huge jump to 140 frames per second, and when overclocked, we get a slightly better 144 frames per second. But when replacing the 2133 MHz memory with the 3600 MHz memory, we see a jump to 163 frames per second. Basically, the 3900X really likes having fast memory. All in all, the performance in this GPU benchmark nearly doubled as a result of the 3900X and faster memory. Now we move on to Cinebench R20, which is a CPU rendering benchmark. The 1600X at stock speeds scored 2596. When overclocked, the 1600X scored 180 points more with a score of 2776. When the 1600X is replaced with the 3900X, at stock speeds, the 3900X scored 6,879. When overclocked, it scored 7,228, and when the slow memory sticks were replaced with the 3600 MHz memory, the score jumped to a very respectable 7,636, which is nearly 3 times the performance of the 1600X at stock speeds. Moving on to the Blender BMW CPU benchmark, the 1600X at stock speeds took a long 5 minutes and 33 seconds. When the 1600X was overclocked, it took 5 minutes and 10 seconds, a 23-second improvement. The 3900X at stock speeds chewed through the BMW in 2 minutes and 4 seconds, which is surprisingly 20 seconds faster than a GTX 1060. When the 3900X is overclocked, it was 7 seconds quicker, and with the faster memory, it was an additional 2 seconds quicker. And it kind of reminded me of, what's that one dude, Matt Stoney, chewing through a dozen hot dogs? When rendering the BMW with the GPUs using CUDA, there was a larger difference in performance. Overclocking the 1600X saw only a fraction of a second improvement, but the 3900X saw about a 2-second improvement over the 1600X, but overclocking the 3900X essentially made no difference. However, replacing the slower memory with the faster memory did make a significant difference, as the render times dropped by an additional 5 seconds. When rendering the BMW with GPUs with OptiX enabled, the differences between all tests were within 1 second. and virtually identical. When running the Blender Barcelona CPU benchmark, the 1600X at stock speeds took 18 minutes and 44 seconds, but when overclocked, the 1600X was 1 minute and 10 seconds quicker. The 3900X at stock speeds took 6 minutes and 28 seconds. When overclocked, it was 22 seconds quicker, and with the faster memory sticks, it was an additional 9 seconds quicker. When using the GPUs to render with OptiX enabled, the scene was rendered in 1 minute and 44 seconds, with virtually no improvements as a result of a CPU change, overclocking, or faster memory. In fact, there was less than a 1 second difference across the board. When rendering the Barcelona scene with GPUs using CUDA, there was a slight improvement with the 3900X, but strangely, not until the 3900X was overclocked. However, some of that improvement was reversed when the slower memory was replaced with faster memory. I honestly do not know what to make of that. The results seem counterintuitive, and I ran the benchmarks a few times to make sure it wasn't a one-off, but for some reason the faster RAM actually made it take longer. Moving on to the Blender Classroom CPU benchmark, the 1600X at stock speeds took 17 minutes and 4 seconds, and when overclocked it took 15 minutes and 57 seconds. The 3900X rendered the classroom in 6 minutes and 10 seconds at stock speeds, and was another 21 seconds quicker when overclocked, and an additional 6 seconds quicker with the faster memory, with the overall result of my new rendering machine being 3 times faster at rendering the classroom scene with the CPU. When rendering the classroom scene using the GPUs with OptiX enabled, the results were very similar to the Barcelona benchmarks in that the overclocking, upgrading to the 3900X, or using faster memory made essentially no difference, with all render times being within 1 second of each other. The classroom scene when rendering with GPU with CUDA was much the same as before. Overclocking the 1600X made no difference, and even going to the 3900X at stock speeds made no difference. However, when the 3900X was overclocked, render times did drop by about 10 seconds, but when the faster memory was added, there was virtually no difference. The Blender Junk Shop CPU benchmark took the 1600X 3 minutes and 3 seconds at stock speeds and 2 minutes and 42 seconds when overclocked. The 3900X was more than twice as fast at stock speeds and took 1 minute and 18 seconds. When overclocked, it was 2 seconds faster, and with the faster memory, it was an additional 5 seconds quicker. When rendering the junk shop scene using GPUs with OptiX enabled, the scene was rendered in 45 seconds using the 1600X, and it was 4 seconds quicker when the 1600X was overclocked. But when the 3900X was used, the scene was rendered in just 35 seconds, but overclocking the 3900X made no difference. However, using the faster memory did drop the render times by an additional 2 seconds. When rendering the junk shop scene using CUDA, it took 1 minute 22 seconds with the 1600X at stock speeds. Overclocking the 1600X was only about 3 seconds quicker. Upgrading to the 3900X took 1 minute and 12 seconds, and overclocking the 3900X was about 5 seconds quicker, and the faster memory was an additional 4 seconds quicker. For the video encoding benchmarks, I used a DVD and a Blu-ray movie as my source file and used Handbrake to do the encoding. The 1600X at stock speeds took 6 minutes and 51 seconds at an average speed of 325 frames per second to encode the DVD. When overclocked, it took 21 seconds less time at a rate of 342 frames per second. The 3900X took 3 minutes and 55 seconds at an average frame rate of 570 frames per second, and when overclocked, it was 7 seconds quicker at 584 frames per second. When the 3900X was paired up with the faster memory, it took 3 minutes and 43 seconds at a rate of 604 frames per second. The 1600X took 39 minutes and 47 seconds at a rate of 53 frames per second to encode a Blu-ray movie. When overclocked, the 1600X was about 2 minutes quicker at 56 frames per second. The 3900X at stock speeds took 17 minutes and 17 seconds at 126 frames per second, and when overclocked, it was about a minute quicker and reached 134 frames per second. When the 3900X was paired with the faster memory, it was an additional 35 seconds quicker and averaged 139 frames per second. In this test, I decided to create a very basic 500,000 particle fluid simulation and test the bake time and preview performance. In this test, I simply clicked the play button and allowed Blender to bake the simulation as it previewed. And then once baked, I allowed it to play once through the animation. I also had it set to 4 subframes. The 1600X at stock speeds took 21 minutes and 43 seconds. When overclocked, it was 42 seconds quicker. The 3900X at stock speeds took only 8 minutes and 39 seconds. When overclocked, it was 15 seconds quicker, and when paired with the faster memory, it was an additional 44 seconds quicker. Upgrading from the Ryzen 1600X to a 3900X of course makes a huge difference when the CPU is being used for rendering. In fact, the 3900X is about 3 times as powerful as the 1600X. But when it comes to GPU ray tracing with OptiX, there's almost never any significant difference in performance. However, in more complex scenes, there is a difference because of the time it takes to prepare the scene to be sent to the GPU is handled by the CPU. And in these cases, a more powerful CPU does make a difference. In CUDA-based GPU ray tracing, this difference is generally more pronounced, and the 3900X does mean better rendering performance, because the time to set up the scene and process the flow of information to and from the GPU and CPU is more intensive with complex scenes. When it comes to any task that requires a lot of data being sent between the CPU, GPUs, and RAM, such as gaming, video encoding, and physics simulations, the 3900X makes a big difference, and the faster RAM also makes a fairly significant difference. I do a lot of physics simulations and video encoding, so the fact that the 3900X with the 3600 MHz memory is up to 3 times faster makes my waiting a lot less boring.